All right, so this week we're in part 2 of a series called Talking Points. We're talking about politics, which is a no-no. But this is a really difficult and divisive topic in a really difficult season of a really difficult year, and it's on everybody's radar right now. So we feel like it's worth kind of jumping into this, diving into this, and talking about a healthy way to handle such a difficult thing. But before I jump too deep into that, what I want to do is take you back in time and think about September of 2001, if you're old enough to remember September of 2001. Right after the events of September 11th, there was a baseball game in Shea Stadium, which is where the New York Mets play. And it was the first like athletic event in New York since everything that happened on the 11th. And the Mets were playing the Braves. They're like arch rivals. And it was at the end of the game. The Mets were losing. But Mike Piazza gets up to bat. Now, if you don't know Mike Piazza, he was the catcher, but he was also like their guy. You know, every kid had a Mike Piazza jersey. And so Mike Piazza steps up, and in this just moment of pure magic, he connects with the pitch, and he just sends it like a mile. He hits a home run, and Shea Stadium just erupted. And with Shea Stadium, like every person who was watching TV in New York, and maybe even in the country. I mean, I don't even think the Braves were really that upset that Piazza hit that home run and that they ended up losing the game. It was as if New York needed something to cheer about, right? We had all just gone through this like seriously painful experience of loss and tragedy and hurt. And together, like just for a couple minutes, we had the chance to get away from that. There's something so powerful about people with a shared identity together and a common purpose. We would call that unity. Now, you and I probably don't like wake up in the morning thinking about unity, but there's part of us that really craves that. There's part of us that craves this sense of acceptance, of belonging, of connection, of a shared identity and a common purpose. I mean, maybe you've been part of a team before and you've experienced that when you come together in victory, or even come together when you lose. There is something that is so soothing when we are together with a common purpose. And what's amazing is that right before he left, we got a little like insight into what Jesus prayed for. It's written in John's Gospel. We talked about it last week. And what he prays for the church, for the people who would believe in him after he was gone. He prays that we would be one, that we would have unity. And if you think about that, that's kind of a weird thing to pray for. I don't spend too much time praying for that. You probably, if you're somebody who prays, maybe you don't think too much about that, but for some reason it was really, really important to Jesus. And what he said was that like when the world sees these people who are different with all different kinds of background come together with this shared identity as his followers with a common mission, it would actually validate their message. It would validate our message. People would look on and be like, whoa, there's something like real going on there. In fact, if you know the story of the early church, like people saw this sense of unity, this sense of like togetherness, the way that people cared for each other, and they were drawn to it. They wanted to get into it. Now it's a little bit different today. The church doesn't have such a great reputation, but a huge part of it is that we've lost this sense of oneness. So we talked about unity last week, and obviously we're talking about politics. Politics is extremely, extremely divisive. It could potentially be a threat to unity, or it could be an incredible opportunity. Like right now, our country is more divided, in a lot of ways, like more divided than it's been at least in a really, really long time. And a unified church in a divided country could say something really, really powerful about what it means to follow Jesus, about the way of life that he offers us. So what we said last week, really where we left off, is that we have to be willing to figure out how to disagree politically and still love unconditionally. Now it's easy to say because, like, I don't know, kind of rhymes, maybe. But it's not really easy to pull off. I mean, politics is one of those things that people feel really, really strongly about, but we need to prioritize this whole idea of being one. And so to do that, unless we're going to change everybody's mind, unless all of a sudden everybody's going to decide to agree on one political view, which is never going to happen, we need to figure out how to disagree and still love unconditionally. So then the question this week is how, right? Like, how do we do that? How do we get there? When I was in 5th grade, I started playing basketball. I started playing in like 4th, maybe 3rd grade, but I loved it. And I joined like more than one team pretty quickly, tried to figure out how to get good at this. And I remember in 5th grade, they introduced the 3-point line to us, which was like my dream because I wasn't doing too much under the basket. If you know anything about basketball, it really wasn't my area. So they introduced the 3-point line, and I remember playing against this team, and I wanted so badly to hit a 3-pointer. And I remember the first time I did. I was so happy, like right away, I just looked over at the other team and started taunting them because, I don't know, I guess that's a real like humble way to celebrate your first 3-pointer. And I remember my coach, real like incredible guy, right away, he pulls me out of the game. Like, hit my first 3-pointer, pulls me out of the game. You know, what I did was I made like an L. If you know Larry Johnson on the Knicks, he made this like really big 3 in the playoffs one year, and he made an L for Larry Johnson. So I hit my first 3, which really meant nothing in a game of 5th graders, and I did the L because, anyway, so my coach pulls me out, right? And I don't remember exactly what he said, but the gist of his message is that we don't play that way. Even if the other team is going to do it, that's not how we play. Even if like most kids are doing that, that's not how we play. Even if Larry Johnson on the Knicks is doing that, that's not how we play. And when it comes to unity, especially as it pertains to like politics, we have to adapt that same philosophy. We have to look at what's going on in the world, look at the way the world handles politics, and just decide that's not how we play, right? We don't play by those same rules. Right now, the way that people interact with each other when something becomes political, it's pretty unhealthy. I mean, imagine if you grew up in a home with, you know, let's say there's like 10 kids, 10 siblings, okay, large family, and 2 parents. And 2 of the oldest siblings are chosen to figure out a family plan. And on this family plan, there's going to be like an allowance, there's going to be a decision about when curfew is. You're going to decide, you know, whose room goes where, and you see what I mean, right? Like they're going to decide the family plan, and each one of them comes up with it, and they propose it, and then all the other kids are going to vote on it, and then the family adopts the family plan. Well, think about like what you wouldn't do to the sibling that had the plan that you didn't like, right? You probably wouldn't try to just utterly destroy their reputation, right? You probably wouldn't all of a sudden like hate them. You probably wouldn't assume that they have the worst motives. You probably wouldn't like automatically think that they're trying to destroy your family with their plan just because it's the one that you don't agree with. The reason you wouldn't do those things to your sibling is because you care about them. Because, like, yes, they might represent a view that you don't have, but they're also human beings that have value. And so we don't just utterly trash them. But for some reason, when it comes to the realm of politics, we take the things that we value, the standards that we live by, and we just choose not to apply them. We choose not to look at people as people. Just yesterday, I read an article about Christians who were celebrating the death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Now, whether or not you agree with what she stood for, this is somebody's grandmother. Like, this is a person with value. Like, how far away have we gotten from the things that we value, from loving one another, that we are now celebrating the death of somebody who represents a different political stance than we do? If we're going to thrive like in this really difficult season with this really like divisive issue of politics, we have to look at the way that the world handles politics. I'm not saying we don't engage in politics. I'm not saying we don't have an opinion, but we have to decide we're not going to play that way, right? There are things that everybody else might be doing, but we're not going to do them because we still like value people, we still have standards that we're not just going to throw by the wayside because we're dealing with the issue of politics, because there's a certain person that we want in a certain position of power. So the Apostle Paul is a guy that we've talked about before, and he's like really one of the most influential people who's ever lived. He started churches all over the world, and then a lot of times these churches would have issues, and he'd hear about these issues, and so to solve them, he would write them a letter and be like, all right, I heard you have a problem here. Hope this helps, right? Send it to him. Well, there's a church in a city called Galatia. They had a little problem. Their issue was that they were obsessed with rule keeping, with right and wrong, with laws. In fact, they tried to bring like the old rules, the Old Testament laws back into their church community. And the Apostle Paul's like, well, pump the brakes. Hold on a second. Let's not do that, right? So he gives them a law. Now, the reason he gives them a law was like really to like touch on their specific issue. Like they were so obsessed with laws. He's like, here, let me give you a law. But really what he's getting at is a command that Jesus gave. This law, he calls it the law of Christ. It's this command that Jesus called like a new command. Back in John's gospel, at like the Last Supper, Jesus is sitting around with his closest followers and he says, all right, here are your marching orders, right? I'm giving you a new command. And the new command is to love one another as I have loved you. Not like love your neighbor as yourself, but love as I have loved you. It's like as if he's saying, you're about to see this like crazy, radical, self-sacrificing kind of love. Like I care about you that much. I'm going to give everything for you. And what I want you to do is love people with that same kind of tenacity, that same like unconditional, self-sacrificing kind of love. And then he says like when you do that, the whole world will know that you're my followers by the way that you love one another. So that's like his big command. In fact, some New Testament scholars, like these really smart people that study the Bible, they would say everything the New Testament says is just an articulation of this one command, like how to love people deeply. And so like in different places in the New Testament, that command is referred to as a number of different things. Here, Paul calls it the law of Christ, right? To speak to their context because they wanted a law. So here's what he says. Carry each other's burdens, and in this way, you will fulfill the law of Christ. So we're asking this question, how? How do we disagree politically and still love unconditionally? Like, how do you pull that off? How do you pull off that crazy, unconditional, self-sacrificing kind of love even when we disagree? Well, here's how. Paul's saying, carry one another's burdens and you will fulfill that law. The word burdens there, it means weight. Carry one another's weight. What he's saying is like, care about what other people care about, and you will find yourself loving them in the way that Jesus loved them. Like, bring yourself to that place emotionally. Now, let's just like pause for a second, like with politics, like step back and just look at this as a general principle. It's a really, really powerful thing. If you can get yourself to the place where you care about what people care about, you will find yourself caring for them, like whether you realize it or not. Like maybe right now, you have a child who's in school and things are rough for everybody. The school situation is not easy, especially for teachers. A lot of teachers have been teaching like crazy hours trying to figure out how to adapt this crazy like way of life. And some things are kind of falling through the cracks and it's irritating some parents. Plus, all of us are like kind of low on patience anyway because we're a little bit tired of this whole like nonstop period of adjustment during this pandemic. And so what's happening is that a lot of teachers are getting complaints from parents. And maybe you're one of those parents who's like tempted to complain because your child is not having like a great experience so far this school year. And that's understandable, right? Because we care about our kids and someone's got to speak up for them. But if you like stop for a second and you're like, okay, well, what's it like to be a teacher right now? What's it like to have tried to have a rhythm for the last 10, maybe even 15 years, and all of a sudden have to figure out how to teach during this pandemic? Like my daughter's teacher has to teach half a class on a laptop and half a class in person. That's pretty tough, right? Like to have two totally different audiences on two different platforms. One's in person and, kids are like poking each other and you got to make sure that they maintain social distance and that they're wearing their mask, but then also make sure that everybody at home, while the parents look on, like if you just stop for a minute, you're like, oh my gosh, that must be so much pressure. All of a sudden, you might find yourself like advocating for that teacher just because you care about what they care about, because you took a minute to try and carry that burden, right? Or maybe you have a coworker and this coworker is just like impatient, cranky, irritable, not really a very fun person to be around. Or maybe you have a boss that's like all over you the past several months and is just like, and maybe if you just stop for a minute and try and figure out like, okay, what's it like to try and run the business right now in this crazy season of life? Or what's it like to like just try and find out a little bit about their lives. Maybe have a conversation with them, and maybe you find out that things at home or things in their personal lives are really, really tough. And if you take a minute to just try and feel that, you might find yourself loving them, like fulfilling the law of Christ, loving people like Jesus loved them. And so like, okay, now back to politics, right? Maybe you're like, all right, so I got to try and like feel what the person on the other side feels. And maybe you like, okay, so you're a Democrat and you're like, all right, let me try and like feel for the Republicans. Nope, can't do it, right? Or maybe you're like a Republican, you're like, okay, let me just try and like feel for the Democrats and like try and imagine what it's like to, nope, can't do it, right? And it's just not working. Well, okay, sometimes that happens. So what do? Well, I mentioned last week that there's a church in Atlanta, Georgia, and they did a series called Talking Points. They talked about politics, and then they gave away their like packaging, their artwork, their graphics, their little videos, and they encouraged other churches to talk about politics. And so they made it available, all their stuff they made available to other churches. And so Tom and I heard this, and we were like, bingo, we need to talk about politics. This is great. And so we used their little video. If you saw the video right before the sermon, we can never make something that nice. We got that from them. So we decided we would talk about politics in our church. And one of the things that he says, like when it comes to like feeling for people that are on the other side, it is so, so important to have the posture or like the attitude of a student instead of a critic. Like go into a conversation or an interaction with somebody with the desire to learn rather than the desire to be critical. Like in the realm of politics right now, in the world, in the game, by the rules that the rest of the world is playing by, like the other side, they're the villain. They're evil people with evil motives, and everything they do is, you know, for some crazy, selfish reason, and they are in it for the destruction of the world and our country, right? Maybe I'm exaggerating a little bit, but there's this tendency to villainize the other side. And when the other side is a villain, well, then we go in like defensive, right? Like critical, trying to attack the villain. But if we don't play by those rules and we don't assume the worst of the people on the other side and we look at them like they're logical, reasonable people, then we can go into the situation like a conversation, maybe even as a student. So I spent a large portion of my life in one area of the country where a lot of people felt a certain way about politics. And in the little community that I was in, people would talk about it pretty often. They would talk about it as it related to their faith. And they would say, I just don't understand how somebody could believe in Jesus, could read the same Bible that I'm reading, and how they could land on the other side of the spectrum, how they could be a whatever, fill in the blank, other party. And I wasn't super into politics, but I would listen, I would hear this, and it made sense to me. I'd be like, well, yeah, I guess they must be crazy, those people. I don't understand how anyone could come to that conclusion. And I felt that way until I moved to another part of the country where people tended to feel a different way, even the Christians. And all of a sudden, I would start to hear them say the same thing, like, I don't understand how somebody could read the same exact thing that I'm reading and come to a totally different political conclusion. And I would hear that and be like, well, I can understand because I heard like all the views of the people on the other side. But for me, for the first time in my life, I was like, oh my goodness, here's somebody who's just as committed to their faith as I am to mine. And they've landed on like on the total opposite end of the spectrum. And they're not crazy, evil, unreasonable people. And for the first time, I honestly could understand how somebody could come to a different political viewpoint. The pastor of the church that did the Talking Points series, he says, like, you'll often hear people say, I don't understand how anyone could be a Christian and land on the other side. And he's like, when you hear people say that, that's a great opportunity to say, well, what a cool place to start. You're admitting that there's something you don't understand. So now you have like an opportunity to go out as a student, not a critic, and try to understand. And what you might see is that there's people on the other side that are just as passionate as you are. Someone once said, like, in order to understand where someone stands, we first have to understand where they sit. Meaning, like, to understand somebody's political opinion or viewpoint, or even just their viewpoint on like the world, we have to understand how they see the world, what their context is like. If somebody grew up in a totally different place than you did, chances are they're going to have different opinions. And it's not necessarily because they're illogical or evil or unreasonable. It might just be because of the context that they were raised in, the way that they saw things. And when we go out with the posture of a student, not a critic, when we assume like positive motives instead of negative motives, we'll see that they're not such bad people, and you might even understand how they came to their own political view, even if it doesn't cause you to change your own political view. And when we do that, when we start to understand how and why people came to the conclusion that they came to, all of a sudden we can start to bear the burdens with them. We can start to care about the things that they care about. And what we might see is that we'll be able to love them unconditionally, even though we disagree with them politically. We can be right with people, even though we disagree about an issue. Not too long ago, I saw this video on YouTube. It was a recording. It was actually a recording from the Larry King live show. And he interviewed two people. One was a pastor of a very large church. This pastor was on the radio. A lot of people knew who he was. And the other one was somebody who worked in the pornography industry. And the two lived like very different lifestyles, but they were very close friends. And so Larry King looks at the two of them and he's like, how in the world does this relationship work out? The two of you are like polar opposites. And then the pastor speaks up. He points to the guy next to him. You could tell the two were friends. They were like laughing and giggling and whatever. And he says, my buddy here, I think that his lifestyle is an abomination. And he knows that I think that. His work, I think, causes more damage to people, young people, old people, families. I think he causes more damage than he realizes. But I'm not going to let the way he lives stop me from caring about him. And so, yeah, we're friends. And I remember watching that and just being so moved. Like, not only did these people disagree politically, probably, I don't even know if they do, but they disagree on the whole way that they approach life. And yet they were still able to love each other. And I remember watching that and just thinking, like, that's what we need to figure out how to do. Maybe if we do that, maybe if we figure out how to prioritize people over politics, we figure out how to carry one another's burdens. I figure out how to care more about you than I do about your view. Well, then maybe we'll be that much closer to disagreeing politically and still loving unconditionally. And we'll be able to be united in a country that's divided. We'll look a little bit more like that vision that Jesus had for us of a church that's one. And maybe it'll validate our message. Maybe people will see that there is something real happening among us. And so that's all I've got for you this week. I hope that we've given you something to think about, something to talk about, especially if you're in a community group. And I hope that you can join us again next week for part 3, Talking Points. See you then.